Hey YouTubers, and welcome to 2017. Now, like I said in the previous video, 2016 wasn't necessarily the best year ever, but it did give us a whole lot of awesome movies. And also, we broke a whole lot of box office records, with Disney basically becoming the highest grossing studio ever in a single year with $5.5 billion worldwide, and even the domestic box office breaking its initial record with $11.17 billion in total. So obviously, there's a whole lot of hype and a whole lot for 2017 to live up to when it comes to movie box offices, and this concept of whether 2017 is actually going to be able to beat 2016 is a topic for a whole nother day, because today we're going to be talking about my predictions for the top 10 highest grossing films worldwide in 2017. Now, when you talk to me, any type of prediction list and everything, there needs to be a little bit of a spin. There needs to be kind of a few wild cards thrown in there. Obviously, we know that there's not going to be an indie film that's going to gross $1 billion and somehow outsell Star Wars and Despicable Me and all this other stuff that's coming out this year. So obviously, we know it's going to be one of the bigger box offices. But which one is that? Well, that's what I'm saving for my 10th spot. That's right, everyone. My wild card for this prediction is War of the Planet of the Apes. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily think this is going to be one of the top 10 highest grossing films worldwide in 2017, but I would beg to differ. These movies have been coming out for the last couple years now, and while Planet of the Apes has been kind of a cornerstone of our entertainment industry for the last couple decades, I mean, who doesn't know about Planet of the Apes up until this point? But these movies have been kind of really successful in terms of critical successes and growing a decent trend and actually having something more of a financial success than some of the other films that we've seen in this franchise. And personally, I feel like if it can continue the same quality, we saw enough of a bump from the original film in this reboot trilogy in the second one that I feel like the foreign markets are going to actually push this one to be one of the highest grossing films of 2017. But tell me what you think in the comment section below. But moving on. Please let this movie be good. Please let this movie be good. Please let this movie be good. Okay, let me just say something here. Warner Brothers DCEU is probably one of the most brilliantly depicted garbage fires in terms of franchise filmmaking that we've seen in a very long time. And it doesn't necessarily look like this thing is going to end anytime soon. And that's kind of a bad thing, because whether or not these movies are critical successes or financial successes, the real thing that really makes money is what they're going to keep producing. But at some point, all the bad energies just starts to pick up and meet you and kick you in the ass at some point. And if this movie is one of those movies that actually does that for DC or Warner Brothers going forward, then if this movie bombs, Justice League is going to bomb, or very close to it, or it won't be seen as a success. And I really hate that, because Wonder Woman not only is one of the most iconic female superheroes, she's probably the most iconic if you look at it that way. And it would be such a shame to see our first big budget female-led superhero movie in all this world of superhero movies to be seen, at least by industry standards, as the shining beacon for the thing that killed the DC movie universe and let Marvel basically just run the whole franchise in terms of extended universe in both cinemas and everything else. It's going to be really disappointing if this movie is a flop critically, but I definitely think it's going to make money. I feel like it's a very safe bet putting it around 9 or 10 or anything for the top spot of 2017. I love Beauty and the Beast. You love Beauty and the Beast. Who doesn't love Beauty and the Beast? And honestly, from what I've seen thus far, this movie looks like it's going to be absolutely awesome. I mean, you have a stellar cast, some great visuals, and who doesn't like a musical, especially from Disney? Honestly, this trend for darker retellings, live-action retellings of all of Disney's old grim tale classics from their animation days, I honestly didn't really like Maleficent or Cinderella or any of those films, but this story actually might be the right balance, or the first one to actually hit the right balance for gritty retelling in terms of darker, but also hitting that lighter tone that Disney is known for. If the trailer views are anything to go by, I feel like people are really excited to see this movie, and it's not going to be hard to see this movie end up in the top 10, either lower or higher. A lot of people think higher. I'm going to be a little bit more conservative, and I'm going to put it around 800 million. Okay, so we already talked about Wonder Woman and how it could ultimately end up really affecting the DCEU going forward. And that's a real problem because Justice League to me seems like a really interesting film. The only problem that I have and a lot of people else are having is that they're really trying to play catch up at this point. I don't necessarily understand why that is when they really have some awesome character-centric stories with all of their comics, the decades worth of material, and they can start telling really intricate stories from these characters that just so happen to live in the same universe, but instead they're just doing their best to shove all these people together in hodgepodge ways that ultimately just don't really work out. And honestly, I feel like it's really going to start catching up to them if these movies are bad this year. And I'm not necessarily expecting this movie to make any more or any less than Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice. I'm just expecting it to kind of hit the exact same level. I'm really hoping better for more critical success, but at this point, I'm beginning to think this movie doesn't even have a chance of breaking the top 5 of the year. Let me ask a question. Does anyone even like Johnny Depp anymore? I'm very serious about this. The guy has enjoyed 2 years at the top spot of the most overpaid actor in Hollywood. And if we're being honest with ourselves, I feel like a lot of people have moved on from this franchise in the last 6 years. I mean, even Disney itself has been dragging its knuckles on the ground trying to get this thing made for the longest time, and I'm sure they're probably pretty worried about it, considering Johnny Depp's performance as of recently. If rumors are to be believed about Orlando Bloom and Keira Knightley coming back, I feel like Disney won't necessarily sit on those things, even if they're cameos, and they'll sell it really hard just to get people back in their seats to kind of relive the glory days of this franchise. And I wouldn't be necessarily too surprised if it doesn't make just as much money enough to give us at least one final film in the franchise. But at this point, I feel like Disney's done. I feel like everyone's done besides maybe Johnny Depp, who might want to keep making these just to get those big ass paychecks. But honestly, I'm done. I feel like a lot of you guys are done, and I don't really expect to see any more Pirates films after this one. I know, guys. I know that you want to see basically all Marvel movies and Disney Star Wars movies at the top 5. And personally, I wouldn't mind that either, considering the pedigree of all these things for the last couple of years. I mean, Disney's been killing it, really. But just between us, I don't necessarily see anything besides Guardians of the Galaxy in terms of Marvel actually making the top 5 or even the top 10 going forward in this year. I mean, there's just way too much going on and coming out. And personally, I feel like while Thor has been more entertaining as of late with his very comedic roles in all the other movies, I feel like they've basically made the most mistakes they have. They're overstuffing that movie, and it's going to be either one of the best movies they've ever made, or it's going to be so critically stuffed with all this other stuff going on that it might be even their first flop. So we're going to have to really wait and see on that. It's way too early for me to make any type of prediction on how much anything is going to make in terms of Thor. Then they also have to basically catch up and resell people on Spider-Man. I know Spider-Man is one of the most popular characters of all time. A lot of people are very excited to see Spider-Man interact with, Tony Stark and all the other Avengers and basically get to play in Marvel's playground that they've been making over the last decade. But personally, I feel like Sony has done a whole lot of damage. They need to actually sell people on this, and it's not a guaranteed success. It's not even a guaranteed $700 million film. It's what you really have to do in order to get on this list of mine. And personally, I think that's a shame. I feel like that's something they're going to have to deal with, and maybe if that movie is a critical success and everyone really likes it, then maybe the future films, and maybe when he shows up and all this other stuff, people are going to be willing to give Spider-Man another chance. I just think that's a mountain they have to climb, and a lot of people aren't necessarily taking note as to how big of a mountain that is to climb or swing over or whatever he has to do. On the other hand, Guardians of the Galaxy was an amazing film. It kind of brought everything together, and if there was one thing hampering it down during its initial run, is that it didn't necessarily hit foreignly, internationally, as well as it did in domestic numbers. I mean, domestic numbers, it did great. It did slightly better overseas. But this time, this is kind of more of an established brand. They're going to be pushing it even harder now because they know that this is an established brand that actually works. And if the trailers are to be believed, it looks really awesome. I can't wait to see everything they do with it. And personally, I just want to see them get to the point where, yeah, if they can make the international markets look at this could probably be even $1 billion movie, but I'm not necessarily that bullish to actually say that that's what's going to happen. So personally, we're just going to have to wait and see, but I'm really excited to see this film going forward. A lot of people think that this could be the second highest grossing film of the year. I don't necessarily think so. I think it's a little too close to Star Wars. We'll have to just wait and see. I know it's its own different creature, so I'm really excited. I hope you guys are really excited, and honestly, I hope this film makes the top 5. I feel like it's very, very high possibility that could happen. I'd be surprised if it didn't. Did anyone think that the seventh film was going to make as much money as it did? I mean, I'm super serious. It became one of the highest grossing films of all time. And considering where this franchise started and how it's been growing up, I think that that is something more beyond any type of success or phenomenal success story than we've ever seen. And honestly, at this point, the sky's the limit for this franchise. Now, I know a lot of the success from the last film was because of Paul Walker's tragic death before they were done filming, and a lot of people wanted to see how they were going to send him off. And personally, I feel like they did a really good job. Honestly, I feel like they did a really good job doing that. But at the same time, I'm just really wondering how it's going to kind of gear up and move on from that really impactful moment, and not only the franchise, but also such a huge part of the fandom. We're watching this because of Paul Walker, or at least the chemistry between Paul Walker and Vin Diesel. So honestly, I'm expecting a pretty big drop here, like around 400 million. I'm having like 400, 500 million at this point. I do believe with the success of this franchise and the most intriguing concept we've seen for a very long time in terms of world building and also kind of making Dom's character, or Vin Diesel's character, somewhat of an antagonizing force that other people have to deal with, and kind of challenging the concept of family, but probably at the very end making it even stronger than it ever has been, is something that's going to be really interesting. I think people are really going to be very psyched about this film. And out of the last four films, it's one of them that has the potential to actually make over $1 billion. And personally, I wouldn't be necessarily too surprised if it ends up being basically the third or even the second highest grossing film of the year. It's just, I'm not that bullish to make that prediction because we have other films coming on that are going to be pushed really hard, that they've been kind of gearing up for a very long time now, or have these unquestionable fan bases that are going to propel these other three movies into being some of the highest grossing films that not only of the year, but maybe that we've ever seen. So, and I do want to say on a last note that one of the reasons these films are actually so popular and so impressive is because they've really kind of taken the concept of a diverse cast of a lot of different walks of life and colors and all this other stuff and make them family and all this stuff. It makes these movies very successful worldwide. And just look at how really well the seventh film did internationally as compared to domestically. Not the domestic film actually performed really well, but when you have a movie actually make $1 billion overseas, just in general, that is a masterclass of in terms of filmmaking and building all this other stuff. So we're going to necessarily have to wait and see. I think the Fast and Furious franchise is definitely in the realm of probably one of the bigger franchises that's ever existed. And I'd be really surprised if this one didn't actually perform not better or on par, but at least within the $1 billion range. Give or take $50 million. We're just going to have to wait and see, but I definitely feel like it's a top 4 material. So Paramount's trying to make a cinematic universe for the Transformers films, both with this and 2 other films on the release date schedule, and then they're talking about Bumblebee movies and all this other stuff they can possibly do in order to actually sell this brand. And personally, I don't necessarily understand it. I'm not saying these movies aren't successful, and in fact, these plans going forward makes me feel like Paramount's going to be pushing these movies even harder than they've ever been. But when you take movies and try to give them extended universe when there's basically no story up into this point, obviously, or at least things that people can even follow, and they're basically bookended chapters of each other where there's not really building a trilogy story or anything else. It's just one thing happens and another thing happens and another thing happens. I'm not necessarily sure how people are going to react to having to actually remember one movie to another movie to another movie, and not just seeing cool robots fight other cool robots and a 3D giant IMAX screen. I just don't necessarily know how it's going to happen. But at the same time, these movies are very successful. I mean, they peaked domestically with the second film and internationally with the third film. And the fourth film did do over $1 billion. I would actually be very surprised if Paramount doesn't push this so hard that they are at least banking on $1 billion in order to guarantee that this franchise goes forward in terms of the extending the universes outside of the main Transformers series. So I would definitely keep an eye on this one. I think we're going to be seeing promotional materials and all this other stuff going forward and just kind of getting a better idea of how Paramount wants to actually take this. This is definitely the starting point in my opinion, and we're going to have to wait and see how they kind of react to the numbers that come in as a $1 billion hopeful for the end of the year, and one of the very few in terms of the 4 that I have here. And going off that, am I the only one who actually sees how weird it is that Illumination is doing really well? Now, a lot of people would say due to their success and even like critical success, at least for audiences, not necessarily critics, that these movies are probably the new Pixar, or Illumination is now the new Pixar in terms of popularity and toy manufacturing and all this other stuff. The Minions are so popular that basically we'd have to go all the way back to the original Cars to find something that just kind of blew up in terms of merchandise sales just for its own thing. They're now cultural phenomenon at their own point. And I just honestly don't understand it. I know the first film was kind of heartwarming and entertaining in its own right, but personally, I'm not necessarily sure. The second film didn't really light any fires for me, and then obviously the spin-off movie with the Minions was also basically a garbage fire, total train wreck as it went on. It wasn't even entertaining for the most part, at least in my opinion, but that movie still made over $1 billion. These movies keep making more with each go around, and every time I see it, I feel like people are just more and more excited about the Minions, whether or not they know who they are or not. When they're dominating toy sales and all this other stuff, I'm just expecting this movie to be the second highest grossing of the film of the year. I'm not necessarily excited about it, but I feel like that's the thing that we're going to end up seeing at the end of the year. These movies appeal to children, and children who are growing up since the first one, who are actually very nostalgic and want to go back and watch this film. So we're just going to have to wait and see. I feel like we're going to see this movie be number 2. Before I go any further, I have to make it absolutely clear that I was actually making these predictions and coming up with all this stuff a couple days before Carrie Fisher's unfortunate death, and untimely death really. And honestly, now we're kind of in a standstill. We don't necessarily know how her death is going to end up impacting Star Wars Episode 8's final box office numbers. There's a whole lot of unforeseen circumstances, and it's really hard to kind of pinpoint exactly where it would have ended up one way or the other. And personally, if you ask me, if this hadn't have happened, we have so much content with Star Wars coming out. We have Episode 7, which left a lot of fans scratching their heads and kind of, I would guess, kind of say they're not necessarily super excited, but I guess it's Star Wars, so there's always a huge amount of people who are excited. Plus, if you look at the box office draws for any Star Wars film, Star Wars is basically a U.S. property. A lot of people in the U.S. really love it. It's just kind of it's our kind of bedrock when it comes to blockbuster filmmaking. It was essentially the first blockbuster film. If you kind of go away and you don't necessarily count The Exorcist or Jaws for that matter, but at the same time, it was the one that kind of established the tradition of the blockbuster films in May and all this other stuff that we've gotten so long. I mean, you talk about Memorial Day being the original start of the box office seasons was because of Star Wars. It used to always open up in that time frame, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sorry if I am. I believe so. And so this is really hard to actually pinpoint, and I'm going to have to make a revised prediction as to what I originally thought. Just to make it absolutely apparent, before Carrie Fisher's death, I was actually guessing that Star Wars Episode 8 would make somewhere around $750 million domestically, while also kind of closing out its worldwide box office was somewhere around $1.6 to $1.75 million, basically $1 billion in international market sales. And this death is something that really kind of changes that in one way or another. We never know exactly how much higher something can grow. And a lot of people for many years have been talking about whether or not something can actually make $3 billion in the worldwide box office. Obviously, that is something that can possibly happen. And in order to do that, you probably need the domestic numbers to go over $1 billion itself, which if you're familiar at all, Star Wars Episode 7 was one of the ones that actually got very, very close to it, but close but no cigar. And then you take those numbers from domestic numbers and you put them along with the international numbers. It's still impressive. It's still incredibly impressive. But at the same time, you look at other movies who have grossed more than Star Wars, like only notably like Titanic and Avatar, and it becomes less so in terms of the international market's excitement for the franchise. But like I said, when you have a major star that people who have grown up with and kind of I guess, consider them kind of family. I mean, look at Carrie Fisher's death and how much people are railing from that and the reaction from it. And I feel like Star Wars is something that's so heartfelt to so many people that we're going to see a flood of people come in. And yes, this is this is my only real conservative estimate. But personally, I feel like because of this, it can probably and will probably get over $2 billion at this point. If not for this, like I said, I feel like my original prediction was $750 million domestically and 1.6 to 1.75 billion worldwide was a decent estimate considering how much Disney is giving us throughout the last couple years. But this, to me in particular, is something that is really always very hard to gauge. I mean, a lot of people are going to talk about Heath Ledger and how Heath Ledger basically catapulted The Dark Knight Rises into being, or not Dark Knight Rises, but The Dark Knight into being one of the largest franchises up until that point, even one of the largest films, definitely in the running, second place for largest domestic films. And then now look at where we've gone, how much our box office has inflated over the last couple years, while, most ticket sales are down, but the inflation of the ticket prices keeps going up, and you have these big monster movies that everyone wants to see. So personally, with the death of Carrie Fisher and being ultimately very respectful to that, I have to say that Star Wars Episode 8 will probably more than likely gross over $2 billion. And I think one of the biggest debates we're going to be seeing over the next 12 months really is whether or not this death and the reaction to this death is going to actually propel Star Wars Episode 8 to actually be a $3 billion film. And like I said throughout this, I'm not bullish. I am way too conservative to actually believe that that's possible up until this point. But if any film can do it, it's probably Star Wars. And I'm going to be very excited to see how not only they handle her death and how they make this basically swan song to her, but how they handle her character going forward. And I think that is going to be a huge issue when we determine whether or not we actually are very excited for or want to see this film just because of that and just general excitement for Star Wars. So I'm going to put my estimate. This is out of the water, but I definitely feel like I'm going to put my domestic estimate at this point to about 1.05 billion. That is phenomenal. I feel like Star Wars has reached a tipping point where if you don't watch it, a lot of people who don't watch it in theaters aren't intending to and don't have the same situation. This is not a Fast and Furious. This is not The Dark Knight situation. Those films always had potential to grow, and they had nostalgic, and they had this gone too soon situation. The same thing that Star Wars 8 is going into because of Carrie Fisher's unfortunate death. But I don't necessarily think that Star Wars is at a level at this point to explode in the way that they did, going up 50% from the last film, or in The Dark Knight Rises cases, you go up the Dark Knight, not the Dark Knight Rises. I keep saying it's confusing, but the Dark Knight's case going up like almost 200% or 100% of what it was of the Batman Begins, and it's just different. It's just a completely different beast. It's going to be almost impossible to determine which one comes which way, and because of that, it's hard to call, but I do think because of this, I definitely feel like we might see domestically our first $1 billion film, unadjusted for inflation. If you take inflation into account, we've had those before. We've had movies that have made the equivalent to such. So it's really hard for me to say one way or the other. Domestic or internationally, I'm feeling like $1.5 billion, something like that, 1.5, 1.6, or even 1.7. This movie is going to be knocking at Avatar's doorstep, and it's going to be very surprising if at the end of all of this, it doesn't actually get to that point where it becomes the highest grossing movie ever made and can go over Avatar. But a lot of people are going to be saying over the next 12 months that this is going to be a $3 billion movie because of this. And like I said, I am not willing to make that prediction. I'm not willing to go that far into this situation. So I know I've kind of been rambling when it comes to Star Wars, but this is something that in terms of making history, in terms of showcasing what we're going to be seeing and how it's going to be reacted to, and all this stuff is going to be really interesting going forward. I can tell you it's going to be the talk of the town for anyone interested in box office numbers going forward this entire year, and I will be covering it hopefully later in much more detail for y'all in the future. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I just think that I'm going to leave it at that, guys. Please make sure to tell me what y'all think about all this in the comment section below. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? Which movies do you want to see make a lot of money? And we're going to talk to you next time in the next Real Numbers video. All right, guys.